Okay, so last time I asked you to watch a video from Stated Clearly that kind of gave you a nice intro to evolution from a biological perspective. Hopefully you kind of poked around and enjoyed learning about it. I think they're really well done, and there's an entire playlist. So yeah, last time we did that. I gave you a way better, or I had smarter biologists give you a better explanation that was like designed to be pretty efficient. But yeah, so this time we are going to talk about evolutionary personality psychology because there is a chunk of it. And you may notice that this is also chapter 9, along with the behavior genetics unit. I broke them in two because I think that they're both important in their own right, and because of how I make the tests, it's like one question per unit, and I wanted an evolutionary psych question as well as a behavior genetics question. So these are both short, but pretty useful, I think. So yeah, this time we're talking about evolutionary personality psychology. So evolutionary personality psychology and just evolutionary psychology in general address or essentially applying evolutionary theory and the idea of natural selection, as well as all of the things we just had explained to you, and apply it to human behavior, which is a little bit on the taboo side. It stirs up lots of controversy. I believe I mentioned this in another video, but there's been a little bit of a time gap between recording the intro and this guy, so yeah, it's controversial. So my biology experience in high school was very strange because we were mandated. Oh yeah, no, I definitely covered this because I remember animating it. But yeah, so I had an entire unit on intelligent design, mandated by Pennsylvania state legislature. Yay! They were all voted out the next year, but it just happened to be the year I took bio. Fun facts. Okay, so the idea is that we're applying evolutionary theory to understand human behavior, addressing how these patterns of behavior that characterize all humans may have originated in in terms of their survival value of those characteristics. There's a lot of assumptions in this, and I will do my best to present them fairly and impartially, but I have a lot of problems with a lot of these assumptions. Now, evolutionary psych in and of itself, this is a totally fine approach. This is a very valid and very interesting, important paradigm. My challenge is when they make an extra leap and assume that just because this behavior is consistent with evolutionary psych, that's why this behavior. So we can't prove, even when you run experiments, that gives you evidence that this is a plausible mechanism. It's not the mechanism, but it's at least one that is not impossible, that it's consistent with what we have. But that doesn't mean we definitely did it. So while I like the research paradigm in theory, in practice, that's my problem. The causal inference leap. So yeah, I will do my best, but I'm very bad at hiding my opinion. I will try, but I will fail miserably. So yeah, the assumption is that these behavioral patterns developed because they were necessary for survival in evolutionary history. The characteristics with more survival value are more likely to appear in subsequent generations. So if something increases your ability to reproduce or your offspring to survive, like until the next generation can produce offspring, that's evolution. That's in theory going to be more prevalent in the next generation. And so what we see today is many generations of iterative behaviors, and those that were more adaptive became more prevalent, and those that less adaptive became less prevalent. That's the idea. Anyway, so yeah, there are pretty strong assumptions here. And as my grandpa would say, you know what assumptions are? They make an ass out of you and me. Oh, that's assumed, but they're dangerous. The basic idea is still you're identifying common characteristic patterns and then determine how those behaviors could be adaptive. Not were adaptive, not definitely this is what happened, that's plausible. That it's not eliminated as a possibility. Alright, also remember the default icons, they are art, and I did not pick them. So here are 3 kind of examples. I'm not going to go, so I encourage you to read these in much more detail in the book because I will kind of give you broad strokes, but there's a lot of nuance that I think the book goes into and does well. So please read those units. My lecture is not going to exhaustively cover it. Alright, so aggression and altruism is our first, evolution and behavior piece. It's this idea that there's increased protection with aggression, and that can lead to dominance in your social group and higher status. So you get higher status, more resources, more likely to mate, because status is sexy, I guess. Oh, also I'm going to scooch so that we... There. Okay. So that we get a little more of me in frame. You'd still lose my hand, but But now this also has negative outcomes. So fighting in war means you dead. In the short term, war leads to great devastation on both sides. So even if in the long term it were advantageous from a resources perspective, in the short term it's pretty rough for everybody. So that's aggression. It's got pros and cons. And so it makes sense why it would appear and remain valuable, but it's not totally dominant because there are downsides. Usually when moderate levels are beneficial, but then extreme levels less so, both high and low. That tends to be the case with a lot of these evolutionary behaviors. Next we got, altruism. So this may increase inclusive fitness by helping and protecting others. So I think the logic is that altruism is helpful for your broader tribe, which are still usually your kin. In my broad family, my Eastern European family that all came over, most of us are actually cousins. We don't just say, oh, we're cousins because we came over on the same boat. No, we're actually cousins, but we're really, really distantly related. I think the closest genetic relationship I have with my Eastern European, broad village cousin is third cousin. So that's 3 generations removed before you get a common ancestor versus probably the average cousin. It's more 5th or 6th generation from the very few documents I've been able to piece together. But, so even though, they may not be, a close kin that I could identify, I mean, it was actually a surprise to a lot of the cousins that we were actually biologically related. Even though it was super distant, it's kind of more evidence to this altruism that you're helping your more distant kin with helping and protecting others, but they're still your kin. So even if it's just first cousins share 1/8. By 6 cousins you share only a little tiny smidge, but you still share that smidge. And if it's mitochondrial, if it's maternally linked, which a lot of the family are, which is kind of cool, through a Jaworski line. Or Jaworski as well as Salzakevich. There's some distant cousin marriages, so yeah. Anyway, so my point is that this being altruistic and helping those around you probably still had some evolutionary advantage, just not in the direct perpetuating your bloodline as in your kids, but by perpetuating your distant bloodline, so your cousins, because they share genes. And so if you help them survive, even if you were to die in the process, you've helped preserve some of your genes through that process. A smaller amount, sure, than if you had kids and perpetuate. So like 50% for your own kid versus like, say you save your first cousin, you only say kind of preserved an eighth instead of half, but still, it's still helping preserve and like your broader kin. So, and as we've gotten into bigger and bigger social groups, it's both less likely that any altruism you do is going to actually affect someone who you actually share DNA with, because once you get beyond sixth cousin, it's really improbable. Like the fact that I'm 20th cousins with the queen, because it's a math thing. Almost everybody is. If you can go back past the, if you can trace yourself to pilgrims or whatnot, you're cousins with the queen. But the fact that we're 20th cousins means you have to go up 20 generations before we have a common ancestor. Yeah, we don't share any DNA. It's infinitesimally small. So when you get broader, I mean, obviously that's an extreme example, but you don't share DNA at that level. But the point still that I'm trying to point out here is that altruism may still help a little. It helped more in the caveman times, but less so now. But still maybe, because you're still got decent close cousins around. Most people cluster in regions, stuff like that. So it's still possible, but it seems, I'd guess it's less advantageous now that there's more like movement. But that would vary by region. So yeah, so that's like the first face bullet point. Next is self-esteem and sociometric theory. And I'm going to encourage you to check this one out on your own because, I mean, Funder explains it way better than I do. And so the idea is that self-esteem reflects the degree of acceptance of others. So it's a metric of like your social standing. And so low self-esteem is linked to lower social status, and higher self-esteem is linked with better social status. Like it's reflected. Yeah, that's the theory, and that people with lower self-esteem are less likely to reproduce because they don't think so hard of themselves. That's the idea with that one, but please read it in the book because Funder does it way better than I do. Now third, in our cutesy little bullet points, so depression, the idea is that the pain signals that something is wrong and has to be fixed, this emotional pain. And so like being depressed is a signal to yourself that you can, that you need to resolve something. Now in addition, and I do not endorse this interpretation, but the logic is not inconsistent, so that crying, like visible crying, might be a way to solicit social support. So depressed people crying would indicate, like then your kin would be like, what is wrong, and try and like help in whatever way it is, and that crying may elicit people to like respond to you and help and give social support. Now in addition to this, the fatigue and pessimism may prevent the wasting of resources. So you eat less, which is not always the case, but in this evolutionary interpretation is you eat less and you do less, so you're burning fewer calories and you're not consuming as much. I believe the book does it better. Like I know I'm doing a disservice to these interpretations. And so I really, really, really encourage you, lean heavily on the book for this chunk. So don't just listen to the lecture, like do it. Okay, and so here, now evolutionary psych in terms of mating behavior, I totally get. Like I buy into this. It's much more, personally, it's much more compelling. And the evidence tends to be more consistent and universal, and there's fewer of these like speculations. So mating behavior. And also it's really obvious how this links to like fitness. So we got two major ones, and also for those of you who are unfamiliar with peacocks, male peacocks be the pretty ones, female peacocks be the less pretty, the more able to disguise themselves. But yeah, so mate selection is from a definitional standpoint is what whatever species, what an individual from that species looks for in the opposite sex. This is all heteronormative, with the idea that your goal is to procreate in the classic like boy meets girl situation, like when which is another problem, but I digress. So yes, the mating strategies are the other piece, and those are how one handles heterosexual relationships. Now, before I move forward, I want to explain why I use peacocks here. So peacocks are a really, really vivid example of how mate selection can create these bizarre scenarios. So, like female peacocks, they look like regular, typical birds. They're normal colored. It looks like they would blend in pretty well with nature. Male peacocks, not so much. So they have got these giant feathers that are really caloric to make and maintain. It makes it harder to avoid predators, because when the peacock tail isn't up, it folds down, and envision, instead of how it tails off with the female, it just drags. And so it's really tough to be a male peacock. But here's the logic that I think is hilarious, and I totally believe is what's happening. So female peacock decides, okay, I want a mate who can handle themselves, who's tough and can totally do it. And obviously the most ridiculously plumaged peacock had to survive with more adversity than the less plumed peacock. So the more feathers you have, the harder it was for you to get to this point, which means you have to be extra badass to have made it. So you've handicapped yourself, but still succeeded. It's like surviving with one hand tied behind your back. And so that's what happened over and over and over and over again. And so the male peacocks that are left survived in spite of all their beautiful plumage. And so the females pick the most beautiful plumage because it's the most burdensome. So then the male peacocks that reproduce are the most beautiful, and on and on and on over the generations, because I bet you male peacocks initially looked like female peacocks. And that the selection happened slowly, gradually, with minor mutations. So yeah, that's a thing. Okay, evolution and behavior. So again, mating behavior. In terms of attraction, there's a lot of male and female, different reproductive strategies here. So both men, male and females of whatever species, in this case we're primarily talking about humans, want the highest likelihood of survival for their offspring. And these differ, so male and female differ in how this goal is pursued and achieved. So female attractiveness is how men perceive their how men select their female mates is those that are considered attractive. It signals youth and physical health and the ability to bear children. So younger folks, young looking ladies, signal they're younger and healthier and whatnot. And then they have the ability to have children and take care of them. While women place more value on economic security and tend to prefer older mates because they're more likely to have accumulated status and resources. So but the goal is the same. They both want the optimal survival. So man wants a woman who can produce good, healthy babies and stick around to take care of them, while woman wants man to be able to provide so she can dedicate her time and energy to taking care of those babies. And older men, more economic security. So that's the idea. Both of them want healthy offspring that'll survive. Now, there are some complications to this. Let me back up a second. So there's additional pieces to this. So while women have to invest more, because they can't just sow their wild oats and just diversify their portfolio, which is kind of one tactic that men can use. So having lots and lots of babies, some of them will survive. Well, with women, they gotta invest a little more because they're cooking it for 9 months. I know it's not actually cooking, but there's more time cost and energy cost for women. There's kind of a maximum number of kids you can have. While with men, less so. Alright, so let's talk about attraction in terms of mating behavior. So there are complications to this. So while attraction is influenced by more than physical, so attraction is influenced by more than just physical characteristics, including perceptions of honesty and whatnot. But there's also this interesting cultural phenomenon in the United States where thinner is considered more attractive, but there is a point where being too thin means you can't bear children. So a lot of really thin girls, a lot of women who suffer from anorexia, they don't get their periods. They cannot produce a baby because they don't have enough energy to sustain themselves. Now obviously that's super extreme, and that tends to not be the issue. Also this larger women used to be considered ideal. That's a little bit of a dubious claim. But for the sake of this class, we're gonna go with it. And so attraction varies over time, by age, all the culture and society. But in either case, attraction is influenced by more than just those physical characteristics. So in theory, women shouldn't care at all about male physical attractiveness, like symmetry, buffness, whatnot. But they do, because we're, people. And so it's not just how much money do they have. It's a combo, how much stability and resource, as well as psychological characteristics like honesty, humility, all those responsibility, having their shit together. Yeah. Now, in addition to that, this last little piece of this slide is culture matters. So there are sex differences in mate preferences differ by country, and this is probably one of the pieces I find really compelling about evolutionary psych and mating behavior, is that we can see differences across cultures now that are really clear and obvious, and they've also changed in our lifetime of documented history, even after evolutionary psych became a thing. So sex differences in mate preferences are smaller in countries with smaller gender gaps in earning and opportunities. So this also holds up with age differences. So in countries where there's less of a need to find a mate who can support you because of economic discrimination, because women getting paid less, there's less need to seek out someone who can provide that economic security, because you can provide it on your own, because you're all strong, independent women and men, humans. So there's more choice now. So both in earnings and opportunity. And so countries where there's more opportunity for women, they don't have to find economic security as attractive, because they can provide it on their own and take care of their cats all by their single selves. All right. Also, not an endorsement for any of the books we see, but they're nice and apt. Okay, so mating behaviors. The strategies for humans, and this is also only for heterosexual couples in the literature that they lean on. So mating strategies are how one establishes and maintains heterosexual relationships. There are differences between men and women, both in terms of their number of desired sexual partners, as well as faithfulness to partners, selectivity of partners, and these are all primarily explained by differences in factors that affect reproductive success. So what does it mean to be reproductively successful? So for men, that means having as many kids as possible. And then, so having a ton and not wasting time taking care of them. Or not wasting time taking care of children who aren't there. So no cuckolding. Like oopsie daisy, that. Or like non-paternity events is what they call them. So the goal is many kids to like essentially diversify your investment. Some of them will survive, and so it's more efficient to just make a ton because it's very low cost to you. This is the logic anyway. So like just sow as many as you can, and some of them will come out to be okay-ish. That's the theory. Now obviously that's not how all men behave for real, but that's the logic, okay? From like, I guess from an expected value standpoint, how many like genes you perpetuate. So, well, women, they don't have that luxury of just like spewing their eggs because they gotta cook it. They gotta cook that baby for 9 whole months. While men, they're done. Boom, boom, boom. They just spread their seed. And see, some of them flop out. So for women, they need to optimize the relatively few children they birth. So they need to find a man who will support them and their children. And so their incentive is to lock him down and not have him wander. Because that spreads out resources. I guess using this logic, it's okay for them to sow their wild oats as long as they don't spend resources on them, on those other kids. That they only focus their energy on your kids. So that's the thinking. And now there's some, but obviously that's not all it is. There's still, lots of variability in this desire. Now, maintaining a stable relationship tends to be advantageous for both, even just from an economy of scale. So, but obviously it's not that cut and dry, but that's the thinking. That's the logic here. Now, in terms of mating behavior, sociosexuality is an individual difference, and we're in an individual differences personality class, so seeing how people differ, which is why I'm bringing this up. It's a willingness to engage in sexual relations in the absence of a serious relationship. In other words, hooking up. Y'all kids today and your Tinder. Sorry, I have to entertain myself with these videos. Anyway, so, it's all about hooking up in the absence of a serious relationship. Men, on average, have higher levels of this, especially those on higher levels, so less restricted, are especially interested in physical attractiveness and social visibility of potential partners. Low levels on this trait are those individuals, men and women, are more interested in personal qualities and potential to be a good partner. So, and in terms of personality perception, there's this neat interaction. So men who have higher levels of sociosexuality tend to know their own value more accurately. So this assumption is an important skill for someone who wants to have sexual relations with many, many women. And they are also more popular. They're more likely to be chosen to get to know better among research projects. They're also better at accurately estimating other people's levels of sociosexuality, which makes sense because if you're going to want to identify who's be open to hooking up, it's good to know if they'd be open to it before you spend your time flirting with them, or when you're at a bar, which girl do you flirt with? Because when you flirt with one, you can't just strike out and then flirt with her friend who's right next to her. You can't do that. It's not gonna work. She's gonna know because she's right there. Unless you're really, really good looking. Maybe. It's still dubious. Alright. So, this is the last little smidge. So mating behavior. So there are gender differences in mating behavior. And in the experience of jealousy. So men report that they are more upset when their partners are, but the idea of sexual infidelity, so like that their woman hook up with someone else, while women are more concerned, relatively speaking, about emotional infidelity. But still, like 55% of men still would be pretty upset with, so like relatively speaking, so 55% of men would be more upset by imagining their partner falling in love, so it's still the majority, versus 88% of females comparing falling in love with imagining their partner in different sexual positions with somebody else. This is probably explained by factors affecting reproductive success. So for men, having as many children as possible and not wasting their time taking care of those children that aren't their own. So you do not want, like, the idea is that you don't want to raise a baby that you didn't make, that doesn't have your evolutionary, like, seed in it, because you're wasting resources. And now for women, the goal is finding a man who will help support them and their children. So emotional, more important for the support. Sexual, more important for paternity. Now lastly, and this is where we'll end, and I know we're running a little long, but oh boy, the sexy son hypothesis is a treat. So the sexy son hypothesis explains an alternative mating strategy for women. It's supposed to try and explain why women hook up with dudes that are obviously just playing the field. This mating strategy is supposed to be the idea that you mate with an attractive but unstable male to provide sexier sons, and so that those sons will be more likely to reproduce. That's the logic. It's hard for me to buy, but it's possible. The book details this great, more detail, and it makes a more compelling case than I do. Next time, we are going to talk about individual differences. So yeah, I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.